Shoes are serious business in prison. Whenever I first arrived at Badger Section, I was given a pair of boots by the shot caller, Sam. This was a big deal to me because a pair of boots was a weapon. It was something to defend myself with. My cellie at the time, Egghead, had been there longer than me and he didn't have any boots yet. And as it turned out, this was telling because he was stomped out on the yard the next day. Whenever I got to High Desert, there were plenty of pairs of boots or shoes from the state available. It's not a big deal anywhere outside of reception. What people tend to wear are personal tennis shoes. Whenever I arrived, my cellie, Doc, the first cellie I had at High Desert, gave me a set of yard dogs. Yard dogs is prison slang for any pair of personal shoes, usually second-hand or third-hand, which are in very poor condition, but sufficient to work out in and be around the house. This is the emphasis because working out is the thing that matters at a softer but still serious yard like a 4 like High Desert. At Badger Section, shoes had been a weapon. At High Desert, they were a tool. They were something to help you get ready. It was still very combat-oriented, but the emphasis was different. And then later, I rolled up and I went to SAT-F, SNY yard, a 3-yard. And shoes weren't really a combat tool at all. They were something to show off, something to look good in. You see, the most that inmates are allowed to spend on any given item is generally $75. This is to discourage theft. The administration doesn't want people having things that are too expensive, and therefore people want to steal them. As a result, shoes are generally worth between $25 and $75. So if an inmate who has just a little bit of money saves up and buys a $75 pair of shoes, and he's very careful with them. He just wears them 1 or 2 days a week. He cleans them after he uses them. He can have the nicest pair of shoes on the yard, the most expensive pair anybody can buy. At least until somebody else buys the same pair of shoes and does the same thing. As a result, you absolutely will have 2 inmates holding up the same pair of shoes at each other, arguing over whose is in better condition. They won't wear the shoes to argue because then they might get scuffed up, but they will hold them up and argue. It's a prestige thing. It's a way to gain face, having the best shoes. There is one exception to the $75 pair of shoes rule, and that is medical shoes. You see, SAT-F was a medical yard, and as a result, there were a lot of medical things you could have done there that you couldn't have done anywhere else. For instance, you could be professionally sized by a podiatrist and have a pair of custom shoes made for you if you had any kind of medical condition that required that, a bad back, you had a limp, anything like this. The shoes were terrible. It took about 3 months of filling out forms, and then they would measure you, and you would have a pair of shoes delivered, and they were giant. Every aspect of the shoe was about 1 inch thicker than a normal shoe. They were clunky, had high soles. They were very thickly constructed white plastic, and they were worth $300. They would charge your books $300 if you had a pair of these shoes made. As a result, you had a pair of $300 shoes, even if they looked ridiculous. Whenever inmates figured out that they could have this done for the price of a medical visit, $5 or less, a lot of guys started doing this just to sell the shoes. And because they're worth $300, believe it or not, there was a market for these shoes. People were perfectly happy to wear a clunky, ugly pair of shoes that wasn't comfortable because it had been custom designed to fit on another inmate's feet. And if you happen to forget which inmate was supposed to be wearing those shoes for whose feet the shoes were designed, you could just look at the back of the shoe. Because every shoe had written on in big, thick letters and permanent marker the name and CDC number of the inmate to whom the shoe had originally been assigned. Medical staff did this to try and stop inmates from stealing each other's shoes or selling them. There was such a market for these shoes that there was actually a rash of thefts of them for a little while at SAT-F. This is relevant because one day while sitting and visiting, my wife and I looked up at Phil Spector sitting in front of us, and he was wearing normal shoes, just the personal shoes he wore to visiting, which wouldn't be important, it wouldn't stand out, except one table to the left was my friend Blue Eyes. He was a ex-NLR, spent a bunch of time in the SHU, got out, and he's a decent guy. Wearing a pair of clunky, oversized state medical shoes with Spector, F75053 or whatever the heck his CDC number was, written on the back. He had somehow stolen Phil Spector's shoes and was wearing them in visiting right next to him. I couldn't believe it, and that afternoon after visiting, I pulled Blue Eyes to the side and asked him, "Where the hell did you get Phil Spector's shoes?" He had bought them from the porter in 5 Block. He didn't know where the porter had got them, but I knew the porter. It was Lizard. I was acquainted with the gentleman. I went and asked Lizard next, "Hey Lizard, you stole Phil Spector's shoes?" And he told me where he'd gotten them. Apparently, Phil had sent them into laundry, which is something that a lot of people do. They wash clothes, they'll wash your whites or your blues, and it happens every week. It's no big deal. You're not technically supposed to send in shoes, though, and whenever Lizard had seen that Phil Spector had sent in a pair of shoes, he took a razor blade that he kept on him and he sliced the laundry bag so the shoes would fall out. That afternoon, whenever everything was being returned, Phil threw the mother of all fits, according to Lizard. He said he grabbed the bag, "Where are my shoes?" And Lizard explained to him, you see, Phil was a guy that you didn't push too far because the administration was going to back him. If they had to move somebody out of the institution, if somebody was going to leave the yard because 2 guys just couldn't get along, Phil was going to stay right where he was. You were the guy that was going to be moved. So Lizard was careful, polite, explained to him that it was his job to take the bag, send it to laundry, and then whenever it came back, take the bag and hand it back to the inmate. "Here's your bag, Phil." He said, "Where are the shoes? It's empty. There's a hole in it." "Phil, I don't know, man. Look, the bag's empty, yes. All I do is hand it to you. Here's your bag. Take it up with the cops." "I want to talk to a cop." Lizard was laughing about how very upset and belligerent this guy got over a pair of shoes. Apparently, he yelled at the cops, he yelled at a sergeant whenever he was called. He just kept pushing the point. "They're worth $300. Where'd they go?" You see, Phil had money, so he'd actually paid for the pair of shoes. The money had come off of his books. Most inmates that paid for state shoes, they just signed a promissory note, and because it was a medical expense, the state forgave them the debt after 90 days. And this is because there are rules in place. They don't want people being bankrupt because they had a medical expense years before. It was just a pair of shoes. I know it seems like a very small thing, but that is kind of the point. In the right context, a small thing can be a very big thing. There are 100, 1,000 things that we take for granted over the course of a day that if we didn't have them, we would miss them so brutally. A pair of shoes, especially if you're in a fight or you have to walk a long distance, a glass of water whenever you're thirsty, the freedom to open up a door and go outside, your freedom in general. It's so easy to take it for granted just day after day and not think about how valuable it is, how sacred it is. That was the one lesson that I took out of prison that I wish I could share with everybody, is that the little things, the pair of shoes, the glass of water, the walking out of the door in the morning and seeing the sunrise on my terms, those are so valuable. Just take a moment. Just one moment and resolve that you'll try to find one of those things today and really, truly appreciate it.